Across a narrow stretch of land in Central America, the Panama Canal works its way through tropical rainforests, rising and falling by steps through the high country of the Continental Divide. This engineering marvel is a 50-mile-long waterway linking the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans through the Republic of Panama. By navigating this route, ships can avoid thousands of miles and weeks of travel from the long ocean voyage around South America. Since its completion by the United States over 100 years ago, vessels of every type have made the crossing in more than 1 million transits between the seas. The Panama Canal became a symbol of American military strength, as well as the national identity of Panama. It has been said that the canal is the reason for Panama's existence today. But the issue of who should own the canal turned into one of the most contested foreign policy debates in U.S. history.
We bought it, we paid for it, it's ours, and we are going to keep it.
And the emblem of Panama's struggle for sovereignty.
We don't want another 100-year treaty. We want this solved now.
Testing both countries would be the growing pains of Panama's struggle for democracy. Resistance of Americans who argued that turning over the canal to Panama signaled the demise of U.S. power.
In the United States, it's still not a popular thing to have given our canal away.
In the midst of widespread dispute, why did the United States, one of the most powerful nations on earth, turn over to Panama, one of the smallest and least developed countries, the most valuable waterway in the Western Hemisphere? And how did it happen? The Panama Canal symbolized American ingenuity, determination, and power. America had birthed a new nation in 1903, and a decade later completed an engineering feat that others could not. But as Americans celebrated, some Panamanians bristled against the treaty that created a country within their country.
In the early 1900s, under Theodore Roosevelt, the states basically drafted a treaty on our own terms without consulting any Panamanian. So I saw that the Panamanians were cheated at the time, and they were threatened by Theodore Roosevelt that you have to approve this unfair treaty, otherwise we're going to let Colombia take over your sovereignty again. So it was forced on them.
Panama was caught in an impossible situation. It owed its freedom from Colombia to the United States, but resisted being an American colony. In the 10-mile-wide canal zone running through the middle of Panama, Americans operated the canal, based military forces, and controlled the territory as part of the United States. Following World War II, tensions grew from complaints to protests. In 1954, riots erupted over the issue of flying the Panamanian flag. A decade later, a student protest turned into violent riots.
They wanted the canal to be successful. It was their biggest economic asset. So they weren't trying to throw the United States out of the canal or close the canal. They just wanted it to be run on a basis that respected their existence as a sovereign country.
Each administration from Eisenhower on understood that the original treaty of 1903 was unjust, and the relationship with Panama was deteriorating.
But all of them also understood that politically, any step towards making anything that could be interpreted as a concession to Little Panama might be interpreted as a sign of weakness.
Panama and Latin American countries in general were sick and tired of U.S. interventions. And the fact that the U.S. could intervene and did intervene in various countries of the region on all manner of pretexts and reasons. So in Panama, that set off the alarm bells.
During the early 1970s, General Omar Torrijos, Panama's leader, was determined that his country would not become another star in the American flag. Rather than fight Washington head-on, he took the case of Panama to the world.
General Torrijos made a lot of noise at the United Nations and the non-allied countries that this was a colony, and that when all the world was getting rid of colonies, we still had a colony in the middle of Panama, and that Panama should have the right to unite the land and to recover the canal.
President Gerald Ford came the closest to resolving the situation in 1974.
A period of nearly 20 years.
Secretary of State Henry Kissinger reached a tentative agreement with Panama to return the canal.
A change in the existing treaty relationship with respect to the Panama Canal is in the national interest of the United States.
But during his presidential campaign, Ford dropped the canal issue after it was made unpopular by his opponent, Ronald Reagan.
When it comes to the canal, we bought it, we paid for it, it's ours, and we should tell Torrijos and company that we're going to keep it.
Ford would defeat Reagan, but for the rest of his presidency, the Panama Canal issue would remain unsettled.
State of Hawaii with 4 electoral votes. Those votes have gone to Carter, and that does it. ABC now projects Carter is the winner with 272 electoral votes.
In the early hours of Wednesday, November 3rd, 1976, Jimmy Carter, a Washington outsider and political unknown, was declared the winner of the presidential general election. An evangelical Christian, Carter's religious faith instilled within him a strong commitment for protecting fundamental human rights.
There can be no nobler nor more ambitious task.
And he sought to bring that commitment to reshaping American foreign policy.
And I felt that human rights didn't just apply to someone to have free speech and freedom of assembly and a right to vote and a right to worship, but I thought human rights meant that big and powerful countries needed to treat smaller countries with justice and fairness.
So this is but one stage in the completion of our historic task.
Within days of taking office, President Carter appointed former ambassadors Ellsworth Bunker and Saul Linowitz to restart negotiations with Panama. Surprising General Torrijos and his team of negotiators, Linowitz and Bunker suggested that the negotiations pick up where the Ford administration had left them.
First of all, we honored the contrary positions of the Panamanians. We didn't try to ordain, this is America's position, take it or leave it. I tried to understand the legitimate requests of the Panamanians through Torrijos and his representatives.
What they did want was the end of the so-called canal zone, that what they said was colonial territory, as soon as the treaty went into effect. And the U.S. would have control over the lands and waters needed to run the canal, but the canal zone as such, as a governmental unit, would disappear.
The negotiating teams finally agreed upon 2 treaties. One declared that the canal would be permanently neutral and gave the United States the right to take action to assure that the canal would remain open, secure, and accessible. The other treaty required the United States to eliminate the canal zone and transfer the property and the responsibility for running the canal to Panama at the end of 1999.
We needed Senate approval, 67 votes for each of those 2. And without one, the other wouldn't have made any sense.
On September 7, 1977, President Carter and General Torrijos met in Washington to formally sign the treaties. In both the United States and Panama, the treaties were met with protests. Students in Panama burned a copy of the treaty, charging that General Torrijos had sold them out to the gringos. And what angered them most was Torrijos' failure to end the presence of American military bases.
We are here to participate in the signing of treaties.
At the formal signing ceremony at the Organization of American States, Carter again spoke about the issue of fairness to an audience of dignitaries from Latin America.
But the treaties do more than that. They mark the commitment of the United States to the belief that fairness and not force should lie at the heart of our dealings with the nations of the world.
Actually, it was a unique moment when you think back, because there was no president before him who had the guts to take it on, and no president since him who had the guts to take it on.
The celebrations, handshakes, and diplomatic exchanges that day would quickly fade as Carter and his opponents began the battle for ratification. On September 26, 1977, the Senate Foreign Relations Committee opened hearings on the treaties.
The Panamanian people want the right to call their country their own.
Secretary of State Cyrus Vance kicked off the hearings, warning senators that if the treaties failed, it would endanger relations not only with Panama, but with all of Latin America, and it could endanger the canal itself. Almost immediately after Vance's testimony, Panamanian Foreign Minister Romulo Escobar told a Panamanian audience that the United States was not granted any rights to intervene in Panama. Treaty opponents in the Senate exploded, and the Carter team scrambled to contain the crisis. It took nearly a month to calm the waters. Carter and a reluctant Torrijos reached an understanding that the U.S. could defend the canal against threats, but not interfere with Panama's internal affairs.
And the way Torrijos sold it to the Panamanian public, because it had to be by a constitution approved by referendum of the Panamanian people, he said, the good news for Panama is that in the year 2000, the U.S. forces will all be gone, every last one of them. There will not be a single U.S. soldier left in Panama. They're all going to be out. And the even better news is that if we are attacked by an outside enemy, we get to call Washington and they have to come in to defend it.
But the efforts to sell the treaties were proving more difficult than expected.
Much of Latin America depends upon the knowledge that the canal will be run impartially and efficiently by the United States. A few Latin American voices have championed Torrijos' position, but most remain silent, possibly because of concerns about United States withdrawal from the canal. I do not believe we should ratify this treaty.
The demagogic argument, which Ronald Reagan was so good at, is overwhelmingly persuasive. It's very hard to counter that argument, because ultimately the counter argument is, if you don't, that little country could do you damage.
Opponents in the Senate waged a determined campaign. They charged Panama was incapable of running the canal.
Here we were, not only relinquishing control over it, but giving control over it to what they described as a tin-horn dictator, somebody that the far right said is sympathetic to communism, is going to be colleagues with Castro in Cuba, and so on. So, there's a lot more to the issue than a ditch.
A delegation led by Senator Robert Byrd found Torrijos a far different man than how he was painted in American media. He was open, engaging, and a brilliant politician.
He told them the truth. He showed them the canal. He showed them what plans were for Panama to operate it. He showed them the justification for the transfer of the canal to the Panamanians. And I would say that that was a major positive factor in convincing doubtful senators to vote for the treaties.
Senate leaders planned to hold separate votes on the two treaties, the Neutrality Treaty in March of 1978 and the Panama Canal Treaty in April. But by late February, support for the treaties was short of the required 2/3.
48 senators introduced a resolution as sponsors declaring that they would never give up the Panama Canal. I had to induce 16 of those, plus all the rest of them, to change their mind.
As the March vote on the neutrality
Up to the end, there was anxiety.
Mr. Byrd of West Virginia, aye.
that anxiety was released when the Senate passed the neutrality treaty with a vote of 68 to 32. One month later, on April 18th, the Senate passed the second treaty, also by a vote of 68 to 32.
My most difficult political job of my life, even more difficult than being elected president, was getting 2/3 of the senators to vote for it because it was very unpopular.
The battle in Congress was not over, and some conservatives were not ready to give up the fight. The House of Representatives still had to pass the treaty implementing legislation.
There were elements built into the implementation that were frankly not consistent with the spirit of the original treaties. That is to say, that gave us greater powers than we had originally negotiated, but that was part of the compromises that were necessary to get it through.
We argue the Panamanians don't have the capacity as a people to manage this canal. These people they don't have the background, the professionalism. They'll make a mess of it. Well, the first time I went down there, I was escorted through the locks, and they showed me all of the operation and so on. And I said, "How many employees do you have here?" And they said, "No, about 15,000, I think was the number." And I said, "How many of those are Panamanians?" They said, "Oh, about 14,000. And I'm thinking, well, if they can't run it, who's running it? They are already running it. The treaties would have ceded the canal to Panama at the end of the century, but there were a great many aspects of what do you do with the existing facilities? What do you do with the various airports, the U.S. Air Force facilities? How do you deal with that?
3 days before the Panama Canal treaties would take effect, the House finally passed a bill that President Carter was willing to sign. The Panama Canal Act, Public Law 96-70, was a narrow victory by a vote of 224 to 202.
And even after we passed it, even if we had the victory celebrations and so on, the American people have never said by a majority vote that they think it's a good idea.
And a lot of the senators sacrificed their political life for a correct vote. They were put out of office by the folks back home.
By 1980, American voters had lost confidence in President Carter, and he too was turned out of office in favor of Ronald Reagan. The Panama Canal treaties took effect on October 1st, 1979, beginning a 20-year implementation calling for the cooperation of both countries to achieve a seamless transfer of the canal from the United States to Panama at the end of 1999. Nearly 600 square miles of Canal Zone territory were turned over to the Republic of Panama, along with a vast number of U.S. assets, including the ports and the railroad. 14 U.S. military bases were transferred. More than 7,000 structures, including residences, warehouses, and office buildings. Thousands of pieces of equipment and vehicles were handed over under the terms of the treaty.
And all that occurred almost immediately with October 1st, 1979. All the planning for that was accomplished before the treaty was implemented, obviously. We were ready to go, ready to transfer massive amounts of property and infrastructure.